Are your assessments really capturing what your students can do with the target language, or are they just measuring memorization and correctness? Well, in today's episode, we're diving into what it looks like to assess performance and proficiency. Now, I'll share tips for aligning tasks to the modes of communication, and then using can-do statements to drive that growth, and then giving feedback that supports risk-taking rather than only focusing on what's not completely accurate. So, let's jump in. Whether you're planning your first lesson or celebrating your 20th year in the language classroom, I understand exactly where you are. I'm Joshua Cabral, and I'm also a language teacher in my 29th year of teaching. Now, I also have the opportunity to support schools and teachers all across the country who are working towards increasing proficiency and building confidence in their students. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast, with over 200 episodes of practical strategies tested in real classrooms just like yours and mine. So let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mis amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for listening, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. I have so much respect for you for wanting to go deeper, to be introspective about your teaching. So thank you very much on behalf of your students and your students' parents and your colleagues and everyone that you're working with, because going that extra mile is so respected by me and by everyone else, I'm sure. So thank you so much for being here. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about assessment and feedback. Now, these are not new topics. We talk a lot about assessment in the language teaching realm and feedback. But what I wanted to do on this episode was bring the two together, because often we talk about creating assessments and sort of IPAs, integrated performance assessments and all of that. And then we have our feedback and how we're helping students grow in their proficiency based on the feedback. But I want to bring them both together so that we can see how that feedback is truly driving students toward that assessment, and how the feedback, which is going to be based on what they're doing in the classroom, that they can learn from that feedback and progress so they can go towards that assessment and then be able to perform in that assessment in a way that is less scaffolded and that they're able to actually focus on what they're able to do. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about assessment and feedback. Now, these are not new topics. These are topics we often talk about. We talk about assessment, we talk about feedback in different ways, whether it's the language teaching classroom, other classrooms. But I want to do it in a way today where we're actually bringing them together and not separating them like we often do, so that we can look at what is that assessment, what are students going to do at the end of this unit based on our can-do statements, and then the feedback that we provide to students throughout the unit, how is that feedback moving them toward being able to perform well on that final assessment. So it's really about seeing feedback and assessment as teaching tools and not just measurement tools. Because what can often happen is when we think about assessment, we think of quiz, test, something like that. It puts a final grade, a summative grade on it, and the feedback might even have grades attached to it as well as smaller quiz grades, depending on what you have to do in your school or your district in terms of grade books. But I want to remove that. Yes, they have to get a grade, but how can we actually use assessment and feedback as a teaching tool that is not just focused on a measurement in terms of putting a grade or a number on it, but how it's going to help to move students forward in proficiency as well. I know that sounds a little theoretical, but you'll see what it means as we go through this, because I firmly believe that an assessment that is tied to goals and growth builds confidence and skills, and it's not just about the grade book. That students, even when they get that final assessment, that they see what they did well, which we don't often do, but we're going to tell them what they did well, and then help them to improve and go even further the next time. So that's what makes it a teaching tool and not just a summative assessment with a grade on it. So throughout this discussion, we're going to focus in 4 different areas. And so I laid it out as 4 different questions that we will look into. So the first question is to look at your assessments and ask, do your assessments reflect performance and communication? And then we'll look at, do your assessments include the 3 modes of communication? And then, do students understand how they're being assessed? And then, does your feedback encourage growth? So we're going to break down those 4 questions and look introspectively into our classrooms and what feedback and assessment looks like, so that we are using it as a teaching tool and not just as a measurement tool. So our first question, do your assessments reflect performance and communication? Now, we're using the word performance, and we also use the word proficiency. So I just want to quickly distinguish, when we say performance, we're talking about what students are able to do with the target language in the classroom, supported by you, the teacher, with scaffolding, with guidance. And even when they are performing on that final assessment, it is based on these situations that we've created where we're supporting students to get there. When we talk about proficiency, that's not necessarily happening in the classroom, because proficiency is in a real-world context that does not have a classroom attached to it, teacher guidance, or anything like that. It is real-world communication. That's what proficiency is. So what we're doing in the classroom is we're setting up these situations where students are engaging in performance assessment, because it has teacher guidance, and that is preparing them for those situations in the real world where their true proficiency will come out. So when we talk about assessment, we are assessing performance because we are helping students with that. Proficiency is not something that we are assessing in the classroom. It is what happens in a real-world context. So that's why we have the question, do your assessments reflect performance and communication, and not using the word proficiency. So now that we have that distinction, we have our assessments, and we know that they should show what students can do in context and not just what they know about the language. Now, notice I said in context, because every time students are doing something with the language, it's never going to be devoid of any context when they're out in the real world, when they're using it. So we always want to make sure that what students can do with the language is what's on the assessment, and it's in a context. And that our assessments, when they are performance-based and they're in a communicative classroom, that it's not assessing them on what they know about the language, verb forms, vocabulary, themes, but what they can do with that. So it's not saying that we're not assessing if they know the verb forms or they know how to agree an adjective or something like that. It is being assessed, but we're actually assessing if they can use it. So step 1 is, in fact, yes, being able to distinguish between the imperfect or the preterite or something like that, but that's not actually what we're assessing. We're assessing using it in context. So it's not that we're not assessing those things. We have this idea sometimes in our communicative classrooms that we never assess grammar, and actually we are. We're just not leaving it at you can say when to use the preterite and when to use the imperfect. That's great, but can you use it in an actual context? Because even if you can describe the differences, that's great and wonderful, but it's not going to help you in a real context if you can't actually put it into practice. Because you have that situation where a student might do well on a vocabulary quiz on food items, but then when doing a role play in a restaurant, not so successful, and they can't really pull it all out and put it into all the context. So if they're able to use it in that context, you are actually assessing their knowledge of that vocabulary, but you're using it in context with them, and that's how you're really seeing what they're able to do. So to some extent, we really do need to rethink what we actually are measuring when it comes to our assessments. So what I would like you to do is to take a look at your assessments in the classroom. You might think of one right now as you're listening to this. So think of one current assessment and answer these quick questions about it to yourself. So if it is an interpretive assessment, so this is something that is a reading or something students are listening to, and ask yourself, are students reading and listening for meaning? Or are you just having them pull out details that show that they understand at the sentence level? Or is there a global understanding and meaning of everything in the end? If it is an interpersonal task, is there a back and forth with the communication? Or is it just one person speaks, another person speaks, one person speaks, the other person speaks, but there's no opportunity to negotiate the meaning or restate something or ask a question about something? That's a true back and forth. And then if it's presentational, so this is presentational speaking, which is prepared, or presentational writing. So ask yourself, do students create language for a purpose? Is there a reason they're writing those 4 sentences besides just using family vocabulary, besides just using regular ER verbs? So is there a reason for creating with language beyond just doing it in practice? Now, they might do some of those things leading up to that assessment, but the assessment is not whether or not they can tell you what the endings of the verbs are, but rather, can they use it in context to communicate? And then the last question is, do all of your activities and all of the modes reflect real-world tasks, or are they just isolated knowledge? So we always want to put a real-world context on it. So I'll give you an example of what that means. So say you have this original task before you looked at them and had all of these communicative questions on it. So you had this original task of label 10 body parts on a diagram. So that's great. That might be something that you do formatively along the way, but that's not communicative. That's not a real-world context. That's just focused on, can you list and name some body parts? Now, a revised version of that, where you're going to put it in a context where you need to use the body parts, could be something such as, a friend got hurt playing soccer. So you text his Spanish-speaking parents describing what happened and what he says hurts. So in this case, that's presentational writing because it's a text, and it's using that vocabulary, that same vocabulary that they would put on that diagram where they're labeling it, but they're putting it in context. So yes, you are quizzing, testing, whatever you want to call it, assessing if they know the body parts, but more than that they can actually use it in context as well. So there are little tweaks that we can do, because if you have to quiz and test on your curriculum that has body parts in it, can you take it and put it into a communicative context where they're actually using it? So that was our first question of, do your assessments reflect performance and communication? So now our next question is, do assessments include the 3 modes of communication? So not just speaking, not just writing, but all of the modes, the interpersonal, the presentational, and the interpretive. So we want to make sure that we build a complete picture of ability. And so this means designing tasks that include all 3 modes and then also provide a context for communication. So not just the grammar point, not just the vocabulary list or theme, but there is an actual context for the communication. So it's sort of going on that idea of labeling the body parts or writing a text about somebody saying what hurts. So going back to that example of labeling the body parts, that doesn't have a context, and then where they're writing the text where they have to use the body parts, that's putting it into a context that has a real-world theme attached to it. Now, there is a place for all of our fun games and activities in the classroom, those things that the students love to do. So I'm not telling you don't do those activities. Sometimes when we talk about our communicative classrooms, that everything's so focused on that assessment and the end point and what they're going to write and what they're going to listen to, and they're so engaged and wanting to be able to do that. And I totally understand that's not the case. I've been in the classroom for 29 years, and I absolutely know that students are not always completely enthralled and engaged in this proficiency process. They enjoy the games and having fun with the language, so absolutely keep doing them. Like if you're doing something with body parts and you have a fun game to practice body parts, that's going to motivate students. They're going to have fun, and they're also going to learn the body parts as one-word examples, but they're absolutely going to learn them. So go ahead and do that, but always move toward the communication goal. Don't just do those activities and then do a quiz just on the body parts because of that. You want to use that as a stepping stone, and then they're going to use them in context because you have your can-do statement about what they're going to do with the body parts at the end. So as we talk about our communicative classrooms, there's a place for all of those motivating activities that students enjoy, but just don't leave it there. Use it as your springboard into having them then use it in context after. I just like to make that distinction because sometimes we can have this idea that making a classroom really communicative kind of takes some of that joy and excitement out of it because we're so focused on the proficiency goals. I don't think that's the case. And again, I'm in the classroom, so I know exactly what I'm talking about here. So to give a few examples of providing context and how you can move to put context on an activity that you might already have. So if you have an interpretive activity, this might be an assessment at the end of the unit, sort of your summative assessment, part of your IPA, or this could just be an activity assessment that you're doing throughout the unit. But say you have students read a schedule and answer questions. Now you can say, yes, here's a schedule from the target language culture, and you're going to answer some questions on it. That is a typical activity that happens in the classroom, but that really doesn't have a context on it. So how can we take that and then put a context on it? So rather than just saying, read a schedule and answer questions, you could say, you're looking at an events calendar for a Latino community center to see what activities are happening this weekend, and you need to understand the schedule so you could decide which events you will attend and when they happen. So you can see that in this case, yes, you are still reading and answering questions, but that is not so communicative. But if you put that interpretive context onto it, it now brings it into a more communicative realm. And then if you have an interpersonal activity where you have partner conversation about weekend plans. So have a conversation with your partner about your weekend plans. Say what you're going to do. So now that, pretty typical, but rather devoid of a context. So you could say, you and a friend are making plans for the weekend. You need to talk about your activities, ask what they're doing, and find out what time you can meet up and what you're going to do. So there you put the full context on it so they know exactly what they're doing, and it's not just a partner conversation about weekend plans. And then for presentational writing, you could say, write a short paragraph about your weekend, or put context on it and say, a Spanish-speaking friend DMs you to ask you what you usually do on the weekends so they can plan something for next weekend when they're visiting. And you write back to describe your weekend and to make a plan. So here, you're putting that context on it, and it's not just write a paragraph. So like when I was saying earlier, where you're just writing 4 sentences because you're practicing family vocabulary. But can you put a context on it? Because when you put the context on it, it makes it real world. And as we were talking about performance and proficiency, this is their performance place. But when they're out in the real world using it with speakers of the target language, they are going to refer back to these real world type scenarios that we've created for them in the classroom. And that's what's going to help them navigate in those proficiency situations when you, the teacher, aren't there whispering into their ear, as I like to say to them. So I'd like to provide you with a framework, sort of example of how you could put these together. So when you have all of the modes and you are making sure that you are selecting a meaningful topic that connects to both your curriculum and students' real-world interests and their needs with the language. So whenever you're doing your assessment, make sure that it is on a similar theme and they're going to build on each other. So you want to identify what is your end goal. Decide what students should be able to do with the target language by the end of the unit. So make sure it's clear and that it's a functional statement that students will be able to describe or compare or reflect on. Anything like that. Those are language functions. So make sure that that is part of what your goal is for students. And then you want to design 3 assessments, at least 3, that are tied to the modes of communication. So you have an interpretive task. And I say at least 3 because interpretive could be reading or listening. So if you do both, you might have 4 tasks. But have an interpretive task. So for this, you want to provide an authentic resource. That could be a text, it could be audio, video, a social media post, but you want students to interpret it. And this includes a comprehension task. That's the first thing, to show that students understand the key details and main ideas, because they're going to use this to engage in the assessment on the other modes, so they really have to have a solid understanding of this text to start with. And be sure to provide that real-world context. So you want to frame the task as if the student is in a genuine situation where they need to understand the resource to make decisions or prepare for an experience. So it's not just read it to understand it, but why do you need to understand this? What is it you're going to be able to do? Like, it doesn't have to be a life or death kind of situation where they need help on something, but in reading a schedule, oh, it's because you want to attend one of the events at this organization this weekend. So that's the reason why you need to understand it. And then you have your interpersonal task. And remember, this is building off of the task that students did for the interpretive and the text that you use there. So for your interpersonal task, you could create a role play or a scenario in which students exchange information, negotiate meaning, and respond to follow-up questions on the content that was in the interpretive task that they just completed. And also put your real world context on it. So you want to make sure to position students as having a conversation with someone they might realistically interact with within that theme. Is it a peer? Is it a community member? Is it a host family? Is it a colleague? So make sure that it's an authentic situation where they would engage in that context. Now, it's likely not going to be a real experience for them. It's going to be fabricated as if you were in that situation. That's what happens a lot in our classrooms. We are likely not living in the target language culture, so a lot of the situations that we create, they are fictional, but students are learning to navigate in this performance situation so that when they are out in the real world, that's where their proficiency will come through and they'll refer back to these situations. And then we have our presentational task. And this is where we want to have students produce a spoken or written product for a real simulated audience. And again, simulated because we're creating these situations. And you want to make sure that you have that real world context again. So give a reason why the audience needs to hear or read what the student is creating. And then you want to connect that to the authentic purpose of sharing information, ideas, and opinions. So this is all building on that original text in the interpretive, and then students engaged interpersonally, and then on the presentational task, and making sure that we're always putting that real world context onto it. And then you want to integrate the context into all of your instruction, because that's just the assessment. So you want to make sure that students know why they're doing the different tasks and how they could apply it in authentic situations. So this not only is going to increase their engagement, but it's also going to push them toward performance that mirrors that real life communication. So all of your tasks leading up to it are helping them to perform on their own on that final assessment, and then eventually out in the real world when they are relying on their proficiency. So the next question is, do students understand how they're being assessed? Now, students make progress when they know what's expected and they know what's next. We don't want any surprises with this. So a couple of suggestions around this are to share rubrics that are tied to the can-do statements. Make sure that your rubrics are understandable to students. So have conversations with your students about the can-do statements. So you could say, you're at this level where it says, I can ask and answer questions about familiar topics. And you want to get to the next level, so you'll need to add more detail and start using connected sentences so they know where they are and where they're going next and how they can get there. So as you're providing these details to students, and we'll talk specifically about the feedback in a moment, but what you're doing here is you are providing that feedback. And so a couple of different ways that you could use this feedback as an assessment and a teaching tool is to use a single point rubric. So this is where you can have 3 columns or 4 columns. I do it as 4 columns, but I've seen them mostly with 3 columns, where the center column is your can-do statement. This is what you're able to do. And on the left, it's blank, and on the right, it's blank in those 2 columns. So on the left is where students are below the proficiency level. So you would write in there what the student did not yet show, because they're not quite at that proficiency level. Or on the right-hand side, you can write what they did to go beyond, and you do it as a simple 3-point rubric that way. So they're either meeting the target, they're below, and you tell them what they need to do to get on target, or they've gone above, and you write what they did to go above. And then you can build in a reflection piece here where you can say, what can you do now and what's your next step based on what they see on the rubric. And a couple of years back, I was speaking with Becky Bray-Rankin, who's a French teacher in Massachusetts, and she said that on the bottom of her rubrics, she puts, this time I chose to and next time I will. So it was this way of students to take the rubric and then to personalize it and what they understand they did this time and then what they're going to do for the next time. And then the last question is, does the feedback encourage growth? So now when feedback focuses only on errors and mistakes, students are going to shut down. But when it shows growth and next steps, it's going to be more engaging for them. So I know I went through the time in my teaching where I would mark up every single error. And then I remember students coming up to me and showing me their paper, and there was so much on it. And they would just say, I don't even know where to start. And that's when I had to really start rethinking about all of this. And that's when I started talking about like the next step, the next time you should try this, and highlighting what they did well. And the result of that is more revision and then less resistance as well. So instead of circling every mistake or inaccuracy, this is in writing, now what I do is I start always by saying one thing they did well. You use transition words clearly. And then I do a growth step. Try using more varied verbs next time. Try writing with other subject pronouns so that your verbs are sometimes different. So rather than focusing on all the little details, because what I did find is they would make all the corrections, they would hand it in, and it was beautiful, now it's an A+, and then they would make the same mistakes again the next time they wrote, because you weren't focusing on specific areas and letting them be a part of that process. And you can also point out to them, one thing I noticed, one thing to try next time, or my favorite one I use all the time is, this shows you're working at the novice high level, and to get to the intermediate low level, you should try. And so that is a way of very concretely having students know what the next thing is. And I have a bulletin board in my classroom with the path to proficiency, and it's what they can do at each proficiency level. And then along with it, I have the suggestions for what they can be doing to level up to the next level. So when I say to them, this shows that you're working at the intermediate low proficiency level, to get to the intermediate mid proficiency level, try, and I have it right there on the wall. And so sometimes I'll be specific about that, or sometimes I'll just say you're working at the novice high proficiency level and you need to be working towards the intermediate low, and they have it on the wall to reference of exactly what they need to be doing to get there. So that's a lot. When we talk about assessment, and we talked about our different questions to be reflecting. Do they reflect performance and communication? Do they include the 3 modes? Do students understand how they're being assessed? And does the feedback encourage growth? There's a lot to take in when it comes to assessment. But I just want to leave you with this idea that assessment doesn't have to feel like judgment, and that's often what it is. But it can be an opportunity to motivate our students by showing what was done well and then guiding them to improve on that. Because you want to let your assessment and your feedback communicate to students that you can do this and here's what's next. And even I know that when we have our evaluations in schools sometimes, it's what's the point of the evaluation? Is it to say what you're doing wrong or to lift you up as an educator, because it's an opportunity every year or every 3 years, whatever your cycle is, to see on paper what you're doing well and how motivating is that. So we should do the same thing for our students, that every time we hand something back to them, that it's an opportunity to celebrate what they're doing well as to see what their next steps are. And if it's always just about next steps and not focusing on what we're doing well, then sometimes that's a very demotivating factor. So be sure to check out the show notes where you'll see the links for many PD opportunities for going further and more in-depth with proficiency-focused strategies. I have quick win courses for individual teachers or on-site, virtual, and self-paced options for schools and language departments. So I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And let's stay connected on social media. You can find me at WL Classroom pretty much everywhere. You'll also find lots of ideas, suggestions, and resources on my website, WLClassroom.com. Now stay curious, keep learning, and continue the great work you do inspiring and supporting your students.